From the big news over the Chinese spy case in foreign policy to the smaller stuff like issues within reform or the significance of the Greens' new leader Zach Polansky in general politics, as well as all the usual explanation and analysis of stats and trends and policy change, the Roundup by News of the Week is the show to watch for clear explanation of political news and in-depth logical analysis. If you were stuck with the news this week, maybe too short on time to follow it, or confused by what you saw, this is the show for you. So let's get started. In news on policy change, Sky News reported that the Chancellor has admitted tax rises and spending cuts are being considered for the upcoming budget in November. The context behind this is that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who is the money man or woman in this case in British politics, has been shown the OBR's report, and it revealed to her the size of the black hole, which is the gap between what's being spent and the budgeted amount. It's not public information, but it's expected to be near enough £30 billion. After seeing that, Reeves was asked about how she was looking to plug the hole, and she responded saying that the government is looking at both taxing and spending, so that's tax rises and spending cuts. The other thing which applies pressure to this is Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, which she set last year. Now, what will the taxes look like, if they're like, and are they likely? So in August and September, we'll be hearing a lot about sin taxes on things like gambling. We've also heard about spending cuts, with a lot of attention this year going to welfare. And that gives us an idea on where spending cuts could be coming from and where tax rises could be coming from. Given Reeves has a borrowing limit through her rules, one or more likely a mix of those two measures are expected. What's kind of unlikely is an increase of things like income tax, which due to Labour's manifesto commitments not to do that. Moving on from money, though, and turning our attention to the environment, the Telegraph reported that Ed Miliband has approved Britain's largest solar farm. The Energy Secretary has approved a project which would cover the equivalent of 2,000 football pitches in Gainsborough. It will be called the Tilbridge Solar Farm and will generate enough renewable electricity to power 300,000 homes. But there would be The site there comes in the middle of two other sites being built in the same area. They're in the approved or are in the approval process, and there are also several other projects across the country as well. And that is to try and meet the Energy Secretary's goal of increasing the UK's capacity from 18 gigawatts to 57 in 5 years. That's obviously a big increase. In the plan he set out in June, he said solar can allow the UK to boost its energy independence while bringing down bills and tackling the climate crisis. He also noted that Labour's increases are nearly 3 times what the Conservatives managed in 14 years. As you can tell by that increase, the Labour government and the Energy Secretary in particular seem to love solar, and they said it's one of the cheapest and quickest power sources to build. Now, is there backlash? Of course there is. We're talking about politics here. Some in the local area where this is going on in Gainsborough are reportedly concerned that the building of all these solar farms will lead to more factories being opened up in the long run, and others object to what they see as eyesores and a waste of money. The Conservative Shadow Energy Minister effectively said that wind and solar take up a lot of space, that the country would better be served by nuclear energy. For what it's worth, Labour are doing nuclear energy. The eyesore stuff also came from reform. Now, are their targets realistic, and will the solar power be effective? Labour have come under fire in the past for their energy targets not being realistic when it comes into economic context, and we'll have to watch their targets and watch how they deliver it, but for now they seem relatively unfazed. Meanwhile, in immigration policy, the Mirror noted a new law will mean that migrants must learn English to an A-level standard in order to work in Britain. So what we're talking about here are the changes to the visa rules which will tighten them. And the bit mentioned by the Mirror is the need to take a test to prove you're capable of listening, reading and writing in English, or basically that you know it to an A-level standard. Currently, the level of qualification that is necessary varies depending on the type of visa, but these rules would tighten it. The changes in the government's immigration white paper will also increase the level needed in some cases. Looking at the government's policy on benefits, the Independent noted that the government were defeated in the Lords over an amendment to the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. The bill, as you can tell by the name, aims to deal with fraud in the benefits system or in any public body. The legislation originally aimed to allow the PFCA, the Public Sector Fraud Authority, to investigate or take action against fraud in a body if it reported it to them. The Conservative Party put forward an amendment in the House of Lords, which would negate that need for the reporting. It would basically mean the PFSCA could investigate if it suspected there was fraud in the body. The amendment passed with a vote of 200 to 194, so by a majority of 6. And Labour ministers seem to believe the bill will not need these amendments, focusing on the role of collaboration and how that might work in routing out fraud, claiming they claim there was incentive for bodies to request fraud checks, and so that it wouldn't be misused or ignored. Well, is that amendment it in regards to the changes? No, the bill has to go back to the Commons first. The amendments then have to be considered by the MPs, which, as the Independent noted, could kind of start a process of called ping pong, which is where legislation goes back and forth between the two chambers. Whether or not this happens is dependent on how radical the changes are, obviously. And while there are disagreements over the change, like I just outlined, it could go through because the pressure of the Lords being a neutral body, it's not like a big flagship thing for Labour, so it could go through. Having said that, the institutional power is in the Commons and so is with the Labour government. If they wanted to stop the amendment, they could, and in that case, Labour could just push the bill through in their original form because there is an unequal power between the House of Lords and the Commons. For those interested, that's because there's no veto. For those interested, what I mean is there's no veto in the Lords. So the Lords can't veto legislation from the Commons because it's an elected body. So all they can do is temporarily delay it. It will go through if Labour wants it to go through. And next up, the I noted a leaked memo has revealed a Labour plan to slash the affordable homes target. Now, a memo from the government of housing officials has showed the target could be slashed from 35% down to 20%. That would apparently be the result of talks between Housing Secretary Steve Reed and the London Mayor Sadiq Khan. It's unclear whether these changes would purely affect London. The article didn't state it very well, and that prompts questions over to whether it could vary from area to area. But at 20%, the target would be half paid for by local councils and then half by developers. It would make it cheaper for developers to build, and that would be the reasoning behind it. It's been reported that no decision has been made yet. Now, where has this come from? Well, it's apparently come from pretty stagnant figures over house building. The Eye reported that only slightly over 3,000 homes are built in the first half of the year, when the government's targets of the year required 88,000 homes to be built. Now that is part of the that would be part of the emphasis on cutting the affordable homes target. That would be the perceived need for home building. But that's despite the obvious impact of there being less homes in designated or less homes that are designated affordable. Now, will it happen? Officially, there's been no confirmation. There have been ministers in the past, like Angela Rayner, who has rejected the change over and over again. But it seems like there are question marks over the real extent of it anyway. Some areas have been calling for different rates of 5%, and others all the way up to 25%. So this 20% figure may be open to varying a little bit. But yeah. Moving on to talk of the smoking ban, the Independent noted a minister has admitted that one part of the UK may escape. But what we're really talking about here is the smoking ban, which was a policy advocated for by Rishi Sunak and his Conservative government. They failed to get it through before the 2024 general election. Labour then took it forward very enthusiastically and have been backing it since. Now, recently, Sir Robert Buckland raised concerns about the bill's passage. Sir Buckland is a former Conservative Justice Secretary and a lawyer. His comments were that it would be incompatible with the Windsor Framework, which would mean it would be incompatible with EU law. Now, I'll explain that quickly because I know that could be a bit confusing. The Windsor Framework is the deal agreed between the EU and the UK over Northern Ireland. It dealt with the key issues of Brexit negotiations, and it meant that Northern Ireland is subject to the EU's laws over goods. And the reason for that is that it would allow trade to flow easier, and it wouldn't need a hard border in the sea or in Northern Ireland, which could have sparked tensions. The reason the smoking ban would be incompatible, though, is because it would ban smoking gradually. When in the EU, you could still smoke at 18. Now, that's a problem for the UK government, as implementing the bill in Northern Ireland could result in a legal challenge, which would more than likely settle in the EU's favour. But it could also fracture the internal market of the UK, which presents that with it, and there are issues there too. Now, obviously, the Northern Ireland Secretary was asked to give an assurance as to whether it would apply in Northern Ireland, and he said it was the government's intention for it to. Obviously, that's not an assurance, and it's likely we won't see the bill for a while in order to give the government to sort it out. But they do have options. They could create a legal case for an exemption to be made and then present that to the courts. They could try and do a negotiation with the EU and get an agreed upon exemption over smoking. Or they could press ahead anyway and try and deal with the legal fallout as it comes. I don't think they'll do that. I think they'll probably hold off and try to renegotiate with the EU because that's been Starmer's stance elsewhere, and also I think it makes the most diplomatic sense. Anyway, that concludes the news I got on policy change. I'm going to move on to foreign policy now. Thinking about foreign policy, in this section, we're actually going to talk about something loosely related to that Northern Ireland bit we just talked about. ITV News had the first story, and it detailed that peers have found democratic oversight measures for Northern Ireland's Brexit rules are insufficient. The Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee has examined the scrutiny arrangements for the Windsor Framework, which is that post-Brexit bit we just talked about. So what are the scrutiny rules? Well, it included an establishment of a committee to scrutinise EU law, and then through something called the Stormont Break, would allow the UK government to reject or veto that law's application in Northern Ireland. So the UK government had a veto over EU law being implemented in Northern Ireland. The committee that I've just talked about, which is the Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee, also thought it was very complicated, and they recommended the government urgently reconsider simplifying the arrangement in order to make it more accessible to businesses and local authorities in Northern Ireland. And to do that, they've advocated for a new unit of the Cabinet Office that would be responsible solely for that purpose, and for the government to be more transparent about the purpose of the Stormont Break. That's all insanely complicated to me, so if you want to go read it, you can. I've linked more about the committee's findings in the text episode of this, so you can go and read that. But will it get acted on? And there isn't some widely reported comment from a minister, where there is usually for this sort of thing, but I found something anyway. The Federation of Small Businesses welcomed the recommendations. It also said it had engaged with politicians in Westminster who acknowledged that there are problems that needs to be resolved. Now that won't surprise you, but that implies this won't surprise you, but that implies there's some sort of a level of agreement over the report in Westminster, and that they are at least aware of it. But I mean, you'd hope they would be, really. The issue is that doesn't tell us how much the government will implement those recommendations. They might do some of them and not others. They might do none, but work to something similar, or they may ignore it completely, although that and implementing it fully are probably the least likely options. Moving on, Sir Keir Starmer has been in the news this week over the role of Britain in the ceasefire in Gaza. The Telegraph said that Starmer has said the UK's recognition paved the way for the peace deal. Upon reading the article, it doesn't seem like that's what Starmer said at all, but you can tell for yourself in a second. The Prime Minister told MPs this week that Britain worked behind the scenes for months along with the USA and Arab and European nations to deliver the ceasefire. But he did say that none of the successes would have been possible without Trump. Now that's despite the US Secretary of State Mark Rubio saying that the recognition made the ceasefire negotiations harder, while Israeli politicians have said the same thing and said it prolonged the war. So did Britain have a big role? Well, it seems she had a role behind the scenes, according to some US politicians, like the US's special envoy to the Middle East. And given that was a characterisation shared by the UK Prime Minister, and some UK ministers, that seems like it could be a good characterisation of the situation. Now we've got all of that out of the way, we're going to move on to something a little more complicated, which is the Chinese spy case. And I'm going to go and try and simplify it for you. I want you to understand this is my understanding of the situation. It might not be completely perfect, but it might also help. To me, the basics are there are questions over whether there was enough evidence to designate China a threat to the UK, so the National Security Act from 2023 could be applied to it. Now, the issue rests over whether the National Security Advisor deemed there would be enough evidence that China was a threat to send that off to the Crown Protection Services. There are accusations that the security advisor didn't submit evidence to the CPS for fears of UK and China relations, and there are also questions over whether the cabinet, and more specifically the PM, was involved. It seems that he said he found out 2 days before CPS dropped the charges. Now, there are further questions over whether the case could be restarted if evidence was brought to light, all while the government has defended itself, noting that the CPS's decision not to pursue charges was separate to the workings of government. Now, what complicates it further is that all of that sits against the second successive delay of the Chinese super embassy in London. It's super basically because it's a really, really big one. That is something the government have also said is the product of the planning process, but obviously, as you can imagine, they've kind of fire for both those things. Okay, doing a complete pivot from the Gaza ceasefire stuff and the Chinese spy stuff, the Telegraph noted that the police are investigating a Reform UK councillor over a born and bred comment. Police in Scotland were investigating a comment from a Reform UK councillor in Scotland for a hate crime after she said that she was speaking as someone who was born and bred here in, I think it was Falkirk. Claire Mackie Brown said there was true unrest and that it was scary as a local resident in relation to asylum protests. She was reported to the Ethical Stands Commissioner for Scotland with the complaint calling for her to be investigated for hate speech, and indeed she was. The complaint came in the form of a 22-page dossier, apparently. Miss Mackey complained that, or claimed that the complaint was malicious. It was intended to damage her her reputation, according to her, and get her removed from her position for just doing her job. In the end, a spokesperson for Police Scotland said they had received a complaint, at which point inquiries were carried out, and no criminality was established. But I want to know what you think. Like, was it a hate crime? Let me know. Now, moving on, the Times reported that Shabama Mahmood has said that Britain has lost control of its borders. Well, the newish Home Secretary was talking to her counterparts from 6 Western Balkan countries, which is a major transit route for people smugglers, and it seems like her goal from the meeting was to make progress on return hubs, with the thought of these countries being the most likely to agree to them. The comments on Britain losing control of its borders came at the start of the meeting, along with a warning that the loss of control undermines trust in leaders and trust in the state. And no returns came from the meeting, but there's usually a fair amount of these sorts of things before anything like this is agreed, so maybe we just need to wait and see. Next, we'll look at Reform UK, whose deputy leader has said they are abandoning a manifesto pledge of £90 billion in tax cuts, and that's according to The Guardian. Now, during the last election, the party made various claims about tax cuts. They made them for junior doctors, over income tax and inheritance tax too. There were also others over tax relief for private school and reducing the level of corporation tax. Now, at the time, these were scrutinised by many for not being fully costed and actually just having wrong numbers, with the IFS calling their numbers implausible. Now, Richard Tice said the party will now focus relentlessly on savings. He said the party would have to deliver on savings first before delivering on the promised tax cuts. And there were always promises about savings in the manifesto, but never on the scale they're currently talking about. The party's leader, Nigel Farage, has said that the party wants to make cuts of £350 billion, which The Guardian noted was the equivalent of the whole school's budget, or a third of the budget for the NHS. Now, are these plans realistic? And unsurprisingly, neither Labour or the Tories think so. But to be fair, there haven't been detailed analyses on them since 2024 because their plans haven't been formally laid out. So there's an unknown element to all of this. But the thing I look for first is that initially their plans were criticised for being unrealistic and that spending cuts wouldn't save what they said it would, and that their tax rises would cost more than they said it would. So chucking more and higher numbers out without saying what they're cutting does not deal with that concern. And also to make things worse is £350 billion is far higher than the amount announced by others, with the Tory proposals for spending cuts last week being just shy of £50 billion. So in short, I'd say no, it doesn't seem like they're very realistic, but I'd also caution to say there isn't very much information available yet either. Now, sticking on Reform and The Guardian, they reported a video exposed bitter infighting with Reform's Kent Council. The video makes it quite funny or maybe quite shocking watching, depending on your persuasion. It's on The Guardian's website, and you can get there by searching the headline I just read out. Or if you don't mind using me as a proxy, you can go to the newsoftheweek.net and click the link to the Guardian article from the text version of this episode. But anyway, what we're talking about here is Kent County Council, or KCC. It's considered one of Reform's big jobs, and the council leader in the video called it a shop window for the rest of the country. But anyway, what was the bitter infighting? Well, it's over local government reforms, balancing the books, and some of the internal processes within the council, like mentoring schemes. But members were muted to silence discussion and told to fucking suck it up. There have been accusations of bullying following 8 official complaints to the Reform South East Regional Director in 3 months. Those complaints followed a defection to UKIP, another councillor being removed from cabinet position, and another being suspended after allegations about their behaviour. A spokesperson for Reform defended the council's record and its administration in Kent on the basis of the savings it's made so far. This is all while opposition parties in the area almost universally panned Reform over issues from infighting to acting in their self-interest. Now, what does that matter for Reform? The big question here is it more than any other party? And there has been noise in the past from other parties in government when tensions are high that things like that are said in the very heat of the moment. It's probably an ugly one, but that's the reality of politics. Although it's few and far between for this to happen, I think that the best way to sum it up would be that it's bad, it's unprofessional, but it's probably not worse than the worst of the other parties. At the same time, it does show Reform to be unprofessional in places. It does damage their credibility by making decisions seem like an argument and making it seem hard to manage. Moving away from Reform, though, LBC noted that the Green leader, Zach Polansky, has gloated about the potential of Labour defections. When the new Greens leader took over last month, Polansky vowed that the party was not there to be disappointed by Labour and instead there to replace it. And now, when he was asked about potential defections, Polansky said he talks to Labour MPs all the time. He did, as most do, decline to name them though. What could this do for the Greens? Well, defections would keep the party relevant. While Polansky has thrust them into the spotlight, there could be more to come from defections. It would allow the party to build on their popularity with the grassroots and make them increasingly relevant in the media. They would also grow their total of MPs, which is already higher relative to their performance in previous parliaments, but that would like secondary benefit to them, but just because they're not going to be overturning a majority with the amount of defections we're probably talking about here. Moving on to stats and trends, The Sun reported that Reform UK would crush Labour and the Tories with the biggest ever majority if a general election was held tomorrow. It projected that Reform UK would win 445 seats, while Labour would be cut down to just 73. In this projection, the Lib Dems would win 42, the SNP would win 41, your party would win 13, the Conservatives would win 7, the Greens would win 6, and Plaid Cymru would win 5. Now, the poll is an MRP poll, one of those multi-level ones we've covered recently, and it surveyed 7,449 voters. Apparently, the results above are excluding tactical voting, which is to me bizarre because people do vote tactically. It makes them a little bit more unrealistic. Anyway, the pollster and the Sun, to be fair to them, noted that the majority would be less if tactical voting was taken into consideration. But the big question is the poll realistic? Polls make a lot of assumptions about voters which may or may not be representative of the choices they would actually make. We're also several years away from a general election, as I always say, so we don't know really what will happen between now and then at all. Also, most other polls are projecting a hung parliament, so for this one to be bucking that trend makes me sceptical there as well. But that's especially the case when the projected majority is so big for a party that won 5 seats at the last general election, but make of that what you will. I'd say no, it's not realistic, but again, that's just my opinion. The Telegraph reported that the IMF has downgraded the UK's growth rate weeks before the budget. The IMF have downgraded the growth rate for 2026 by 0.1 percentage points to 1.4%. That affects the total or cumulative growth expected before the end of next year as well. That comes amid a higher unemployment rate and projections seeing the UK's inflation being the highest in the G7 over the next 2 years. Means there are less jobs available while inflation and therefore prices are growing quicker. That is before considering tax increases expected in October as well. Now, moving on, The Guardian reported the Green Party has reached 100,000 members for the first time after Polansky became its leader. The Green Party membership has reached 100,000, which is a first for the party, and in doing that, they've overtaken the Lib Dems, who are on 83,000 and around 500 members. Party officials say they are on course to overtake the Conservatives in membership figures, and those numbers are not public, but it's thought to be above 120,000. Does that matter? Membership isn't always an indicator of performance electorally. The big example, and the one that the article pointed out, is that Jeremy Corbyn massively expanded party membership but failed to win 2 elections. And furthermore, many party polls have shown the party's chances not really changing. And where the increasing membership could matter for a party like the Greens is in generating support for their grassroots, which makes them a bigger deal in terms of confidence, in terms of protests or campaigns or what have you, and given they're a party of activism primarily and a left-wing green populism party, the grassroots can be an important building block for it, so maybe there's some significance there. But that concludes the news I got this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you found this episode useful, please remember to like, subscribe and comment wherever you're watching. Feel free to go check out my other show called Stupid Stories, and that's on TikTok, Instagram, and sometimes on Facebook too. Or if you want to see the text version of this episode, you can check it out on my website, newsoftheweek.net. I'll be back next week with another episode of The Roundup, but for now, have a good week. Bye.